She tried to trade her virginity for food, her last, desperate roll of the dice. But when the rancher looked her dead in the eye and said the 5 words that would change everything, her world didn't just shift, it shattered. "Gold isn't what we need," he said, his voice like stones grinding together. "You are. What would you do? You've been starving for 17 days. You've walked until your feet are just bloody stumps inside boots made of torn leather and hope. You decide to sell the one thing you have left, the last shred of yourself, for a piece of bread. And the person you offer it to tells you they don't want it. They want you." The wind didn't just sting Clara's face, it clawed at it, a bitter, dusty predator. Behind her, the path she'd walked was a scar on the cracked earth, a trail of shame and sweat and fear. This morning she'd made a choice that felt like swallowing glass. She would offer up her body. No price, no pride. Just a desperate trade for survival. Her knuckles were white as she gripped the ranch gate. The wood was sun-bleached and tired, groaning in the wind. For a second, she thought about turning back. Dying with dignity out in the hills sounded better than this. But then her stomach seized, a hot, angry fist clenching inside her, and she saw a fat hen pecking at the dirt near the fence. Eggs. Fresh eggs. Dignity could wait. Shame would have to starve. She pushed the gate open. It screamed on its hinges. She raised a trembling hand to knock on the heavy oak door of the ranch house, but before her fist could connect, it swung inward on its own. A man filled the frame. He was tall, built from the land itself, with arms corded from work and skin baked by a relentless sun. His eyes had seen things, she could tell. Hard things. But they weren't cold, not yet. His name was Elijah. She didn't know that then. All she knew was that he was the man who would either save her or destroy her. "You lost?" he asked. His voice was steady, too steady. Clara couldn't meet his gaze. The dirt on the porch floor seemed incredibly interesting. "I don't want trouble," she mumbled, her own voice a dry rasp. I just want food. Anything." He didn't move. He just watched her. He took in the filth on her cheeks, the way her frayed collarbone peeked out from her torn shirt, the hollowed-out look in her eyes that screamed of ghosts. He waited. The silence was a physical weight, pressing down on her, crushing her. "I'll work," she added, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I can clean, I can cook, whatever you need." Still, he said nothing. His silence was an accusation. She bit her lip, tasting blood. The desperation finally boiled over. Or if that's not enough," she whispered, the words scraping her throat raw. I'll give myself to you, for a night. You can have me. Just, please, I haven't eaten in days." The world stopped. The wind died. The only sound was the frantic, terrified drumming of her own heart in her ears. She hated herself. She hated the words. She hated the pathetic creature she'd become. Her knees felt weak, ready to give out. Then Elijah stepped forward. Not to threaten, not to accept, just to close the distance so his words would land like arrows. "Gold isn't what we need," he said, his voice calm, but with an edge like sharpened steel. "You are." Clara blinked, confusion cutting through the haze of hunger. "What?" "I don't want your body," he said, his eyes boring into hers. "I want your hands, your heart. I want the courage it took for you to knock on this door when you could have just laid down in a ditch to die. That kind of courage, that's worth something here." She stood there, frozen, suspended in a moment that didn't make any sense. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Not since the mines collapsed and took her father. Not since her uncle cast her out, telling her she was nothing but a mouth to feed and trouble waiting to happen. It was a language she didn't understand. Then, from deeper within the house, a woman's voice called out, thin and reedy. "Elijah, is someone there?" He turned his head slightly, but his eyes never left Clara. "Yeah," he called back. Someone important. He held the door wider. It wasn't an invitation. It felt more like a summons. Clara didn't move. She felt stripped bare, not her body, but her soul. He had seen straight through the desperation, the filth, the shame, and he hadn't recoiled. He'd seen value. It was the most terrifying thing that had ever happened to her. Slowly, one blistered foot in front of the other, she stepped over the threshold. The warmth of the house was a shock, a physical blow. It smelled of wood smoke and baking bread and something rich, like stew. Her knees gave a violent shudder, but she locked them, refusing to fall. Not now. A woman stood by a massive stone hearth. Her hair was shot with gray and pulled back in a tight bun. She had soft eyes but a hard jaw, and her apron was dusted with flour. She looked from Clara to Elijah and then back to Clara. Her gaze was sharp, analytical. It wasn't kind. It was calculating. "Get her a bowl," the woman said, her voice clipped. Her name was Mara. "I can pay," Clara whispered, her hand instinctively clutching the hem of her shirt, as if the worn fabric was all she had. "We don't take that kind of payment here," Mara said, her eyes narrowing. "Sit." The command was not gentle. Clara sat. The wooden chair groaned under her meager weight. Elijah placed a steaming bowl of stew on the table in front of her. Chunks of meat and vegetables swam in a thick, dark gravy. Her stomach roared, but she didn't touch it. She stared at it, her mind screaming that this was a trick. Food this good didn't come for free. Nothing good ever came for free. "Eat," Elijah said. It wasn't a suggestion. She ate. Slowly at first, then faster, the hot stew burning her tongue, but she didn't care. It was warmth and life, and it filled the screaming void inside her. With every spoonful, the shame mixed with a confusing, overwhelming gratitude. She didn't look up. She just ate. Mara brought her a cup of water. Clara drank it all, her hand shaking so badly that water sloshed onto the table. No one commented. They just watched. Their silence was unnerving. When the bowl was empty, scraped clean, she finally risked a glance upward. Elijah was still watching her, not with pity, with an unnerving intensity, an interest that felt predatory. "Where did you come from?" he asked. She swallowed. The food sat heavy in her gut, dry hollow, or what's left of it. It's just dust now. She recited the facts of her tragedy like a rote prayer. Mama died of the fever. Little brother, too. Just me. She left out the part about the man who promised to help, the man who took her family's last heirloom, a simple gold ring, and left her with nothing. That part of her story was a shard of glass lodged in her heart. "I've got nothing left," she said, the words tasting like ash. "Not even pride." "That's not true," Mara cut in, her arms crossed tight against her chest. "You've got the strength that carried you to that gate. You've got a spine that's still holding you upright. That's something." Her words sounded less like a compliment and more like an assessment, as if she were judging livestock. Clara looked down at her hands. They were thin, scratched, shaking, worthless. "We need help on the ranch," Elijah said, breaking the tension. "You stay, you work. Simple trade, no favors." He paused, his eyes locking with hers again. No shame. The room seemed to tilt. This feeling wasn't safety. It was disorientation. It was a game with rules she didn't know. Mara showed her to a small cot in a back storage room. It smelled of hay and dust and something else, something faintly metallic, like old blood. Clara didn't care. It was a roof. She lay on the lumpy mattress that night, eyes wide open in the darkness, listening to the house settle around her. The floorboards creaked with footsteps that paced back and forth, long into the night. She wasn't afraid of starvation anymore. She was afraid of what she had just agreed to. She had a terrible, sinking feeling that the price for that bowl of stew had not yet been paid. Morning didn't come with a gentle sunrise. It came with a sharp rap on her door. "Up!" Mara's voice cut through the wood. "Work doesn't wait." Clara scrambled off the cot, her body screaming with a new kind of ache. Not the gnawing pain of hunger, but the protest of muscles being asked to move. The cot in the storeroom hadn't been a kindness. It was a pen. She stepped outside into the cold pre-dawn air. The valley was beautiful, bathed in soft gray light, but the beauty felt threatening. The rolling hills seemed like walls, hemming her in. The sky was too big, too empty. Elijah was already in the fields, a silhouette against the rising sun. He wasn't repairing an irrigation line. He was standing beside a series of freshly dug holes. They looked unsettlingly like graves. Mara shoved a pair of worn boots into her hands. They were stiff and heavy. "Let's put those hands to use," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Clara followed her to the barn. The work was brutal. She hauled buckets of water that felt like they were filled with lead, her arms trembling under the strain. She tried to carry a sack of feed and collapsed under its weight, spilling grain into the dust. She expected a sharp reprimand, a slap. Instead, Elijah appeared at her side, silent as a shadow. He didn't offer a hand. He just looked at the spilled grain, then at her. "Waste," he said, the single word a condemnation. He righted the sack himself, his muscles bunching effortlessly, and hauled it away without another word. Mara watched the exchange, her lips a thin, disapproving line. She didn't mock Clara's weakness. She just seemed to be cataloging it, adding it to some invisible ledger. The shame was worse than any physical punishment. It was a cold, creeping thing that settled deep in her bones. All day they worked her, digging, hauling, mending fences under the hot sun. Elijah moved with a relentless, powerful rhythm. Mara directed everything with sharp, efficient commands. There were other ranch hands, maybe half a dozen of them, but they never spoke. They moved like ghosts, their eyes downcast, their faces grim. When Clara tried to catch one of their eyes, they would immediately look away, as if she were contagious. It wasn't a team. It was a chain gang. That evening, they ate in the same tense silence as the day before. The stew was hot, the bread was fresh, but it tasted like ashes in Clara's mouth. She wasn't a guest. She wasn't an employee. She was an asset being tested. "You're weak," Mara said suddenly, her voice dropping into the quiet. Clara flinched. I'm trying." "Trying isn't enough," the old woman said, her eyes like chips of flint. "The land demands more. It always demands more." Later, Elijah cornered her by the water pump. The sun had set, leaving the sky a bruised purple. "My mother is hard," he said, his voice low. "She's seen what happens when people aren't strong enough." "What does happen?" Clara whispered. He didn't answer. He just looked out at the darkening fields, at the strange, grave-like holes she'd seen that morning. "The harvest has failed for 3 seasons," he said, as if that explained everything. "We're running out of time." That night, a storm rolled in. Not rain, but wind. A howling, screaming gale that rattled the very bones of the house. Clara lay on her cot, listening to the walls groan, her heart pounding in time with the roaring wind. She heard shouts outside. Risking a look through a crack in the storeroom wall, she saw Elijah and the other hands wrestling with a huge tarp that had come loose from a haystack, fighting to pin it down before the wind ripped it away. It was a battle against nature, and they were losing. Then, a flicker of lightning illuminated the scene, and Clara saw something that made her blood run cold. Carved into the main support beam of the barn, half hidden by shadow, was a symbol, a strange, spiral-like marking, and below it, a series of names, scratched crudely into the wood. She could only make out a few: Sarah, Rebecca, Anna, and there, at the bottom, was a fresh space, empty, waiting. She stumbled back from the wall, A hand clapped over her mouth to stifle a scream. This wasn't a ranch. It was something else entirely. And the phrase, "we need you," suddenly had a terrifying final meaning. They weren't just testing her strength for farm work. They were testing her for something else. They were looking for a sacrifice. The next day, the air was thick with unspoken tension. The failed struggle with the tarp had left everyone on edge. The wind had torn away more than just canvas. It had torn away the thin veil of normalcy. Clara moved through her chores in a fog of fear. Every glance from Elijah felt like a measurement. Every instruction from Mara sounded like a prophecy. The names on that barn post were burned into her mind: Sarah, Rebecca, Anna. Were they girls like her? Girls who had stumbled onto this ranch, starved and desperate. Girls who had failed the test. She had to know more. She had to find a way out. During the midday meal, while Mara was distracted with the stove, Clara saw her chance. A small, weathered, leather-bound book sat on a high shelf near the hearth, almost hidden behind a stack of plates. It looked old, personal. A journal. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She had to see what was inside. Later that afternoon, she was sent to the barn to muck out the stalls. The air was heavy with the smell of hay and manure. The silent ranch hands worked nearby, but they kept their distance, as always. As she worked, she kept her eyes on the house, waiting. Finally, she saw Mara leave, heading towards the lower pastures with a bucket. Elijah was on the far side of the property, mending a long stretch of fence. This was it. Her hand shook as she dropped the pitchfork and crept back toward the house. The back door was unlocked. She slipped inside, her bare feet silent on the cool wooden floor. The kitchen was empty, filled with the ghosts of the morning's meal. She reached up to the high shelf, her fingers brushing against the dusty spine of the journal. She pulled it down. It was heavier than it looked. The leather was cracked with age, held shut by a simple tie. With trembling fingers, she undid the knot and opened it. The handwriting was neat, elegant, but frantic. The ink was faded in places, smudged in others, as if by tears. The first entry was dated 7 years ago. My name is Anna. I arrived here 3 days ago. The rancher, a younger Elijah, and his mother took me in. They fed me. They spoke of work, of earning my place. But there is a strangeness here, a fear in the soil itself. Clara's blood went cold. Anna. It was the last name on the barn post. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the desperate script. Anna wrote of the same things Clara was experiencing: the relentless work, the unnerving silence of the other hands, the feeling of being constantly watched, judged. But then the entries took a darker turn. Mara speaks of the covenant, a pact made with the land generations ago. She says the valley is alive, but it is a hungry god. It gives, but it also takes. Every 7 years, when the soil begins to tire and the crops wither, it demands a price. Clara swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. They are looking for the chosen, a woman of strong will and a pure heart. They say only such a soul can appease the valley, can be wedded to the land and renew its life. They say it is a great honor. I see the graves on the hill. I do not think it is an honor. I think it is a death sentence. Clara slammed the book shut, her breath coming in ragged gasps. It was all true. They weren't just looking for a worker, they were grooming her, fattening her up like a prize calf for slaughter. The failed harvests, the desperation in Elijah's eyes. It all clicked into place. They were on a deadline. The valley was starving, and it needed to be fed. She had to get out. Tonight. She shoved the journal into the waistband of her trousers, pulling her shirt down over it. She ran back to the barn, her mind racing. She couldn't just walk out the front gate. They would see her. She had to wait for the dead of night. The rest of the day was a blur of forced composure. She mucked the stalls, her muscles screaming, her mind screaming louder. She ate her dinner, forcing the food down past the lump of terror in her throat. She tried to act normal, tired, beaten down. When Mara showed her to her storeroom cot, Clara mumbled a thank you and closed the door. She listened as the bolt slid into place from the outside. A prisoner in her cell. She waited for hours, listening to the sounds of the house die down. The pacing footsteps of the night before were absent. The silence was absolute, heavier than ever. Around what she guessed was midnight, she moved. There was a small, high window in the storeroom, barely big enough for a child to squeeze through. It was her only hope. She dragged a wooden crate beneath it, her movements stealthy and slow. She climbed on top, her fingers finding the rusted latch. It wouldn't budge. She pulled harder, gritting her teeth, feeling the skin on her fingertips tear. With a final, desperate heave, it gave way with a sickening screech of metal on metal. She froze, listening. Silence. She pushed the window open and hoisted herself up. It was a tight squeeze. Her hips scraped against the frame, and for one heart-stopping moment, she thought she was stuck. She wriggled, pushing with all her might, and then she was through, tumbling onto the soft dirt outside. She was free. She didn't run. She crept, staying low to the ground, using the shadows of the outbuildings as cover. The moon was a sliver in the sky, offering little light. The main gate was her goal. If she could get to the road, she could just run, and never look back. She reached the edge of the barn, the place where she'd seen the names. She peered around the corner, her heart in her throat. The path to the gate was clear. She took a deep breath and darted out from the shadows, and ran straight into a solid wall of people, the other ranch hands, all of them. They stood in a silent human barricade between her and the gate. They weren't holding weapons. They weren't moving towards her. They just stood there, shoulder to shoulder, their faces illuminated by the faint moonlight. And for the first time, she saw the look in their eyes. It wasn't malice. It wasn't anger. It was pure, unadulterated terror. And it wasn't directed at her. They were looking past her, back towards the house. A floorboard creaked on the porch. A shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows of the house. It was Elijah. "Running so soon?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. "But the ceremony isn't until dawn." Clara stood frozen between the silent, terrified workers and the man who had saved her only to condemn her. Her escape had failed. The trap had sprung. The other workers didn't move. They were statues carved from fear. They weren't stopping her for Elijah. They were blocking her in with him. They were all trapped. "What ceremony?" Clara demanded, her voice shaking but defiant. She clutched the hidden journal at her waist. "The one where you feed me to your hungry God? The one Anna wrote about?" Elijah's expression flickered. Surprise. He hadn't known about the journal. "You don't understand," he said, taking a step towards her. "I understand perfectly," she shot back, taking a step back. "You find desperate girls, you test them, and if they're strong enough, you sacrifice them to this valley. What happens to the ones who fail? Do you just bury them in those holes in the field?" He stopped. The silence stretched, taut and brittle. Then, from the doorway of the house, Mara spoke. "The weak ones are sent away. We have no use for them." Her voice was cold, pragmatic. "The land requires a pure vessel." "So you admit it," Clara spat, her fear turning to rage. "You're murderers." "We are survivors," Elijah said, his voice laced with a deep, weary pain. "This land, this valley, it's not normal. There's a power here, a covenant, just like the book says, but it's not a God we serve." "Then what is it?" He hesitated, looking back at his mother. Mara gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "It's a curse," Elijah said, "a curse of blood, and we are its keepers." This wasn't the answer she expected. It threw her off balance. "A curse?" "Generations ago," he began, his voice taking on the quality of a grim fairy tale. Our ancestor Jonathan worked this land. A wealthy baron named Silas Kane wanted it. He saw the magic in the soil, the way things grew here like nowhere else. He tried to buy it, then threatened for it. Jonathan refused. He loved this land. So Kane, who dabbled in things men shouldn't, cursed it. He poisoned it with his own dark magic. Clara stared at him, trying to process the wild story. Magic? Curses? It sounded insane. The land began to die, Elijah continued. The crops withered, the animals sickened. Jonathan was about to lose everything. But then a traveler came, a woman who was running from something. She was starving, alone. He took her in. And where she walked, the land began to heal. Where she worked, the crops began to grow. "What are you talking about?" Clara whispered. "She was Silas Kane's daughter," Elijah said, the words landing with a heavy thud. "She was running from him. Her blood, the Kane blood, was the poison. But her will, her choice to nurture the very land her father tried to kill, became the antidote. It's not about death, Clara. The sacrifice isn't giving a life. It's about a member of the Kane bloodline, willingly choosing to give their life's work to this land, to serve it. That's the only thing that keeps the curse at bay." Her head was spinning. "So Anna?" "We thought she was the one," Mara said, stepping onto the porch. "We spend our lives searching for them. Lost children of the Kane line, scattered to the winds over the centuries. We offer them a home, a purpose. We test them, not for purity of heart, but for purity of blood." "And what happens if they are?" Clara asked, her voice barely audible. "We ask them to stay," Elijah said, "for 7 years, to work the soil, to pour their life force into it, to be the valley's heart. After 7 years, their service is done. The land is renewed, and they are free to go, with our thanks and a share of everything the ranch has earned." "Anna refused," Mara said, her tone sharp with old disappointment. "She was the one. Her blood was pure. But she was weak-willed. She believed the valley wanted to kill her. She ran, and the land has been dying ever since." Clara's mind reeled. The journal. It was all a misunderstanding. A story twisted by fear. They weren't murderers. They were desperate gardeners looking for a very specific kind of seed. "Why me?" she asked. "Why did you think I was one of them?" Elijah's gaze was intense. "The trader in Dry Hollow, the one you met before you came here, he passed through a week before you arrived. He was selling trinkets. Among them was a simple gold ring. He told us he got it from a desperate girl whose family had just died. A girl heading this way." Clara's hand flew to her chest. Her ring. Her father's ring. "It wasn't just a ring, was it?" Elijah asked softly. "It had a marking inside, a small spiral, the crest of Silas Kane." The world tilted on its axis. The ring. The stories her father told her about it being in the family for generations, a symbol of their resilience. It was all a lie. Her entire life, her identity, was a lie. She wasn't the daughter of a poor miner. She was the descendant of a monster. "But your test," Mara said, her eyes narrowing on Clara with a new, dismissive coldness. "It came back this morning, the water from the sacred spring. If a Kane descendant drinks it, the water shimmers. For you, it did nothing. Your blood is thin, useless." The hope that had flickered in Elijah's eyes died. He looked at her not with menace, but with crushing disappointment. "We were wrong about you," he said. "You're not the one." The words should have been a relief. She was safe. They didn't want to sacrifice her. They didn't want anything from her. But somehow it felt worse. To be told you were chosen, special, the key to everything. And then to be told you were just another starving stray. Nothing. Useless. "So what now?" Clara whispered, looking at the silent workers who were now slowly, cautiously lowering their arms. "Now," Mara said, her voice devoid of any warmth. You eat breakfast, and then you leave. We've wasted enough time on you. The dismissal was as sharp as a slap. She was no longer someone important. She was a mistake, a failed experiment to be discarded. The other workers wouldn't meet her eyes. They shuffled away, their brief moment of shared terror dissolving back into silent, separate suffering. The ranch was still a prison, but she had just been pardoned, and it felt like a death sentence. Clara packed her meager belongings in a daze, an empty sack, the worn-out boots, and Anna's journal, which she kept hidden. They gave her a loaf of bread and a canteen of water, a parting gift, a severance package for the girl who wasn't magical enough. Elijah walked her to the gate. He wouldn't look at her. The easy camaraderie they had started to build was gone, replaced by an awkward, heavy silence. He who had seen her courage now only saw her failure. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his hand on the gate latch, for the misunderstanding. "Am I the first mistake you've made?" she asked, her voice quiet. He flinched. "No," he admitted. "We've been wrong before. We get so desperate. We start seeing the signs everywhere. We want it to be true." She looked back at the ranch house, at the fields struggling for life under the sun. She looked at the faces of the other workers, etched with a permanent, weary resignation. They weren't just workers. They were people Elijah and Mara had taken in, people they cared for, a makeshift family living on the brink of collapse. Her heart ached for them, for him. "I hope you find her," she said, and was surprised to find she meant it. The right one. He finally met her eyes, and she saw the full weight of his burden, the generations of responsibility, the fear of being the one to fail, to let the land die for good. "Me too," he whispered. She turned and walked away, not looking back. The gate groaned shut behind her. She was free. She was safe. She had never felt more alone. She walked for 2 days, heading east, away from the cursed valley. The bread ran out quickly. The water was half gone. The familiar pangs of hunger returned, a dull ache that was almost comforting in its familiarity. It was the pain she understood. On the 3rd day, she saw a rider approaching from the opposite direction. A dust cloud on the horizon that slowly resolved into a man on a fine black horse. He was dressed in expensive, clean clothes that looked completely out of place in this desolate landscape. As he drew closer, her heart leaped into her throat. It was the trader from Dry Hollow, the man who had taken her ring. He pulled his horse to a halt, a wide, predatory smile spreading across his face. "Well, look what the wind blew in," he said, his eyes raking over her. "Thought I might find you out this way." "What do you want?" Clara asked, her hand instinctively going to the hilt of the small skinning knife she'd taken from the ranch kitchen. A pathetic weapon, but better than nothing. "Just making a delivery," he said, his smile widening. He nodded back the way he had come. "My employer is very eager to meet the girl who's been living on his property." "His property?" Clara repeated, confused. "That's Elijah's ranch." The man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Not for long. He's been squatting on it for years, the poor fool. But the true heir has returned, and he's very interested in family reunions." Before Clara could react, 2 more riders appeared over the ridge, flanking the trader. They were armed. She was trapped. "Don't worry," the trader said, his eyes glinting. "He doesn't want to hurt you. He just wants what's his, the land, and you." They took her. There was no fight she could win. They tied her hands and put her on a horse, leading her back the way she'd come, back towards the valley, back towards the ranch. As they rode, the trader, whose name was Silas, talked. He was a braggart, pleased with himself. He told her about his employer, a man named Alistair Kane, the last true descendant of the old baron. Alistair's been tracking that family for years, Silas sneered, waiting for them to get desperate. The curse was his ancestors' greatest work, you see, a deed to the land written in blood. The land only answers to a Cain, and these fools, they've been tending his garden for him all this time. They're trying to break the curse, Clara said. Silas roared with laughter. Break it? Girl, they don't know the half of it. They think it's about service, about healing. They're sentimental idiots. The curse isn't a disease, it's an engine. It doesn't just make the land fertile with a Cain's touch. With the right words, the right ritual, it can be forced, controlled. The power in that valley can make a man a king. Clara's stomach turned. Elijah's desperate quest for a healer. Alistair saw it as a search for a key, a tool. And now he's found you, Silas said, looking at her with a gleam in his eye. A lost daughter of the line, the final piece. They tested me, Clara said, a desperate bluff. My blood is worthless. Silas just smiled. Oh, their little spring water test, that's folk magic, cute. Alistair has the original grimoire. He knows the real signs. The test isn't in the water, it's in the earth. That ring wasn't just a crest, it was an amplifier. It focused your energy. That's why he sent me to get it from you, to make sure you couldn't access the power on your own. He wanted you weak, lost, ready to be found. It was a web of deception so vast it made her head spin. Elijah's family had been lied to for generations, following a corrupted version of the truth. Alistair hadn't just been waiting, he'd been manipulating them. When they arrived back at the valley, everything had changed. Silas and his men didn't ride to the ranch house. They went to the opposite side of the valley, to an old, abandoned homestead Clara had only seen from a distance. A camp had been set up, tents, armed guards, and in the center of it all, a man stood waiting. Alistair Cain was handsome, charismatic, and his eyes held a chilling, absolute confidence. He was the mirror image of Elijah. Where Elijah was earth and grit, Alistair was steel and shadow. Clara, he said, his voice smooth as silk. Welcome home. He explained his version of the story, a story where his family were the rightful owners, and Elijah's were thieves who stole the land and perverted the sacred rituals. He claimed the service was a lie they told their captives. They've been kidnapping my ancestors for 100 years, Alistair said, his voice filled with theatrical rage. Forcing them to work as slaves to power their pathetic farm. They are monsters. But now, you and I, we will take back what is ours. He offered her a choice. Join him, and together they would unlock the valley's true power. She would be a queen, with wealth and influence beyond her wildest dreams. He would perform the ritual, a ritual that would bind her to the land, and the land to him. She would be the conduit for his power. And if I refuse? She asked. His charming smile vanished. Then I will take the ranch by force. I will burn it to the ground, and I will perform the ritual with or without your consent. It is more potent with a willing heart. But a terrified, broken one will suffice. Your choice is between a throne and a cage. He gave her until morning to decide. They locked her in one of the homestead's crumbling rooms. There was no window to escape from this time. She was alone with her choice: trust the desperate, misguided family who had cast her out, or side with the charismatic monster who claimed to be her kin. She pulled out Anna's journal. She read it again, not looking for facts about the curse, but for the truth about the people. She read about Elijah's kindness, even when he was testing her. She read about Mara's harshness, but how she sat up all night with a sick calf. They were hard people, trapped in a desperate situation. But were they evil? Then she found it. A passage near the end, one she'd missed in her panicked first reading. Elijah found me trying to run. I thought he would hurt me. Instead, he just looked sad. He told me I was free to go. He said the choice had to be mine, or the land would reject it. He said a heart given in fear was no gift at all. He packed me food for my journey. He apologized. It was a lie. Alistair's story was a lie. The journal she thought was a warning was actually a testament to Elijah's character. Anna hadn't been a prisoner who escaped. She had been a guest who chose to leave, and Elijah had let her go, just as he had let Clara go. Alistair wouldn't let her go. He would use her, willing or not. Clara knew what she had to do. She had to get back to the ranch. She had to warn them. She looked around the room. There was no escape. The door was solid oak. The one window was boarded shut. But the homestead was old, the floorboards rotten in places. She knelt down, running her hands over the floor. Near the wall, one of the boards felt loose. She worked her fingers into the crack, pulling. It groaned, but it moved. Using the heel of her boot, she stomped down hard. The wood splintered. She stomped again. And again. Finally, a section of the floor gave way, revealing the dark, musty crawl space beneath the house. It wasn't a throne or a cage. It was a third option, the one she would make herself. She slipped through the hole just as the first hint of dawn was breaking. Clara scrambled through the crawl space, dirt and cobwebs clinging to her. She emerged on the far side of the homestead, hidden by a thicket of overgrown bushes. Alistair's camp was stirring, guards patrolling the perimeter. She couldn't get past them. She looked up at the steep, rocky cliff face that formed the northern wall of the valley. It was treacherous, nearly sheer in places. But it was the only path Alistair's men wouldn't be watching. No sane person would try to climb it. Clara was no longer sane. She was forged from desperation. The climb was hell. The rock crumbled under her fingers and feet. Twice she slipped, her life hanging by a single precarious handhold. Her muscles burned, her lungs screamed for air. But the image of Elijah's face, etched with weary hope, pushed her onward. The memory of Mara's gruff kindness, of the silent workers' shared fear, fueled her ascent. She reached the top as the sun crested the horizon, her body a symphony of pain. Below her, the valley was laid out like a map. She could see Alistair's men, armed and mounted, beginning their ride toward the ranch. She had no time. She ran. Not on a path, but straight down the other side of the ridge, tumbling and sliding through scree and thorny bushes, heedless of the cuts and bruises. She had to get there first. She burst out of the tree line and into the ranch's main field just as Alistair and his dozen riders came into view at the far end. The ranch hands were already outside, their morning chores interrupted. They froze, seeing the approaching force. "Elijah!" Clara screamed, her voice raw. "Mara!" They came out of the house, their faces a mixture of confusion and shock at seeing her. "It's a trap," Clara gasped, stumbling towards them. "Alistair Kane is here. He knows who I am. He's lying to you. The service, the choice, it's all real. He wants to force it, to take the land's power for himself." Alistair and his men were getting closer, a wave of dust and menace. "Get inside!" Elijah yelled at the other workers, pushing Clara behind him. He stood his ground, unarmed, between his home and the invaders. Mara emerged from the house holding a heavy rifle, her face set like stone. "Kane!" Elijah bellowed, his voice echoing across the valley. "This land is not yours!" Alistair reined in his horse, a cruel smirk on his face. "It has been mine all along. You've just been keeping it warm." He looked past Elijah to Clara. "My dear cousin, running back to your jailers, I'm disappointed." "They're not my jailers," Clara said, stepping out from behind Elijah. She faced Alistair, her small frame trembling not with fear but with a newfound, searing rage. "They're my family." The declaration hung in the air. For the silent ranch hands, huddled by the barn, it was a spark. For Mara, it brought a flicker of something fierce and proud to her eyes. For Elijah, it was everything. "Touching," Alistair sneered. "Well, this family reunion is over. Seize her, burn the rest." His men spurred their horses forward, brandishing weapons, but the silent ranch hands didn't run. They grabbed what they could, pitchforks, shovels, heavy lengths of wood. They weren't fighters, but they had spent their lives working this land. They were strong, and for the first time, they had something to fight for besides mere survival. They had a home. They surged forward, a desperate, determined line. The two groups clashed in a chaotic explosion of violence. It was brutal and ugly. Alistair, staying back from the fray, watched with cold amusement. His target was Clara. As two of his men broke through the line, heading for her, Elijah intercepted them. He moved with a farmer's strength, a blur of motion, disarming one man and pulling the other from his horse. But he was outnumbered. Clara knew this couldn't be won with force. The answer wasn't in fighting. It was in the land. "The spring!" she yelled to Elijah. "The test was a lie. It's the earth." She turned and ran, not away from the fight, but towards the very center of the oldest, most fallow field, a patch of land so dead and cracked it looked like a scar. Alistair saw her, his eyes widening in understanding and fury. He spurred his horse, charging after her. "Stop her!" he screamed. Clara ran, her lungs on fire. She could hear the thunder of hooves right behind her. She reached the center of the dead patch and fell to her knees, digging her fingers deep into the dry, lifeless soil. She closed her eyes, blocking out the chaos. She didn't have the ring. She didn't know any magic words. She only had what Anna's journal had described, a choice, a willing heart. She poured all of her pain, her fear, her loneliness, her gratitude into the ground. She thought of the first bowl of stew, of Elijah's quiet respect, of Mara's tough love, of the shared desperation of the other workers. This wasn't a sacrifice of service. It was a declaration of love. "I choose this place," she whispered into the dirt. "I choose these people. I am home." Alistair was upon her. He leapt from his horse, his face contorted in a mask of rage. He reached for her. And then the ground shook. It started as a low tremor, a deep hum that vibrated up through Clara's bones. A wave of energy pulsed out from where her hands touched the earth. The dead soil around her darkened, as if drinking in a sudden invisible rain. Alistair stumbled back, his eyes wide with disbelief. "No! It's not possible! Not without the ritual!" The pulse intensified. Tiny green shoots, pale and tentative, began to push their way up through the cracked dirt around Clara. The dormant life in the valley, held captive by the curse, was awakening. The fighting stopped. Everyone, ranch hand and raider alike, stared in awe as a wave of vibrant green spread out from Clara in a perfect circle, chasing the brown away. The land was healing, not just season by season, but moment by moment. "The power is mine!" Alistair shrieked, lunging for Clara again. But Elijah was there. He tackled Alistair, and the two men went down in a tangle of limbs. They were no longer fighting for land, but for the soul of the valley, embodied in the kneeling girl at the center of the miracle. Elijah was stronger, fueled by a righteous fury. He overpowered Alistair, pinning him to the rapidly greening earth. "It was never about power," Elijah grunted, his voice ragged. "It was always about love." The green reached the edges of the valley. The crops in the fields stood taller, fuller. The leaves on the trees seemed to shimmer with new life. The curse, the engine of greed Alistair had wanted to command, was broken. The covenant wasn't a pact of service to appease a hungry god. It was a promise that life, chosen freely and given with love, would always triumph over death and greed. Alistair's men, seeing their leader defeated and witnessing a power they could not comprehend, threw down their weapons and fled. Alistair lay on the ground, defeated, the life-giving energy of the valley now feeling like poison to his corrupted soul. He was a king with no kingdom. Clara finally looked up, her hands still pressed to the living soil. She saw the faces of the ranch hands, no longer silent or fearful, but filled with a tearful, joyous wonder. She saw Mara, the rifle lowered, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. And she saw Elijah, walking towards her, his face bruised, but his eyes shining with a love so profound it hurt to look at. He knelt in front of her in the new grass. He didn't say anything. He just reached out and gently took her dirt-caked hands in his. The gold ring hadn't been the key. Her bloodline hadn't been the key. She was. Her choice. Her heart. "Gold isn't what we need," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, finally finishing the thought he'd started at the door. "We just needed you." Spring bloomed eternal in the valley. The land, finally free, gave its gifts with an impossible abundance. The ranch didn't just survive, it thrived, becoming a beacon of hope in a harsh and unforgiving world. The silent workers found their voices, their laughter echoing in the fields where they now worked, not as prisoners of fate, but as partners with the earth. Mara's harsh edges softened, revealing the fiercely protective heart that had always been there. Alistair and his man, Silas, were handed over to the authorities in the nearest town, their tales of magic and curses dismissed as the ravings of madmen. They were imprisoned for their more mundane crimes of theft and assault, forgotten by the world. Clara and Elijah were married a year later, not in a church, but in the center of the field where she had knelt and chosen her home. She wore no special dress, no veil. Her only adornment was a simple braid of sweetgrass woven into her hair. They didn't exchange rings. They exchanged seeds, pressing them into the soil together, a promise of a future they would grow side by side. Years passed. The story of the girl who woke the valley became a legend, a whispered tale told around campfires. The ranch became a sanctuary, a place where the lost and the broken could find their way. Clara was often the first person they would meet. She would stand at the gate, her hands calloused from work, her eyes filled with a deep, knowing peace. She would see the same hunger, the same desperation she had once carried, and when a newcomer, starved and ashamed, would offer to trade whatever they had left for a place to stay, Clara would smile. She would look them dead in the eye, seeing not the grime or the fear, but the flicker of courage that brought them to her door, and she would tell them the words that had saved her life. "Gold isn't what we need here," she would say, holding the gate open wide. "You are. If this story reminded you that your true worth isn't in what you can offer, but in who you are, then do more than just listen. Become part of our community. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because you won't want to miss the stories we have coming. Every single one is a testament to the fact that even in the darkest of valleys, the right choice can make a world bloom.